The Wings of Floreth, Book 2, The Princess's Brother, Part 2, Long Live the King, Chapter 24, A Walk in the Dark Forest. The crowd dispersed slowly, each villager returning to his or her own homes. Galiki and Tay descended the steps and joined their family just as everyone else in the village. They too had things they wanted to pack for the journey. Within 10 minutes, there were only 3 left standing in the street near to the municipal building. Creeley had been left alone at the top of the steps where he waited for the villagers to return. The other 2 were Reyes and Gaggara. Reyes couldn't help but notice that Gaggara seemed to have her eyes on everyone who walked by them. He began to get the distinct impression that she was sizing them up, as if considering how easy or difficult they might be to hunt. He also had the feeling that her stares were causing the villagers to feel more than a little uncomfortable. Reyes felt he'd better put a stop to it before she lost them the goodwill that they had gained by liberating the village in the first place. He tapped Gaggara gently on the shoulder. "Come on, my angel. Leave these people to their business." "What is their business?" Gaggara asked. "I thought we were leaving the village." "We are, sweetie," Reyes replied. "The villagers are just off fetching their belongings, and they'll be back before long. Come on, let's go and join Creeley. We can wait for them together." Reyes took to the air and flew quickly over to the steps of the municipal building. Gaggara followed close behind. She didn't land on the top of the steps as Reyes had done. Instead, she flew up to the roof and landed on one of the 2 flat parts at the front of the building. "She prefers to be high up," Reyes explained to Creeley, "so she can see that much further." "Fair enough, I suppose," Creeley commented, peering up at her. Creeley had given the villagers an hour to go and fetch their stuff. As the end of the hour approached, the villagers began to filter back into the street. No one wanted to be left behind. Some of the villagers had clearly taken it to heart that there was going to be no return. They had laden themselves with far more stuff than they would comfortably be able to carry for the entire journey. Even some of the children were carrying so much stuff that there was simply no way they'd be able to even see where they were going. The villagers had also brought out every possible mode of transport they could find. There were 3 hand carts. Basically, these were carts that had been used to ship merchandise to Leamington. There was a single barrow from which one of the local merchants had plied his trade, and there was even a horse-drawn flatbed cart. One horse looked old and bedraggled, and its upkeep was probably far more than the owner could comfortably afford. At least the owner wasn't a selfish man. He hadn't used all the room that was available in his cart, and was allowing what space remained to be used by the youngest of the village's children, those who would otherwise have to be carried by their mothers. Fastbrook was a fishing village. It didn't have much in the way of farms, and therefore not a lot in the way of livestock. There were a couple of geese, a few ducks, and 3 dairy cows that had been kept purely for their milk yield. There was no public clock in Fastbrook, no way for Creeley to know when an hour had passed. He had to be playing it by ear. When it looked as if everyone had returned from their houses, he took a step forward and asked, "Is everyone here? Is anyone missing?" There was a murmuring among the crowd. The villagers seemed to be checking through their immediate family, ensuring that not one of them had been forgotten in the hurry to get away. "I feel sorry for them," Gaggara commented offhandedly. "They seem to have so many things, and yet they have no freedom. Tied down to a single location all their lives until something like this comes along and takes it all away from them. Even then they don't seem to be able to let go. I'm glad I don't put such store in things." "I know what you mean," Reyes replied. He had been there. The night he had escaped from the castle and his own execution, he had been forced to leave everything behind except those few things his family had handed to him. Of those few things, he had nothing left. "It looks like everyone's here," Creeley commented. He glanced at Reyes and said, "We're heading east to begin with. Can you and Gaggara begin to scout the way?" "Sure thing," Reyes replied. "And it's Gaggara." "Yes," Creeley acknowledged. "Sorry." Reyes flew up to the roof and landed next to Gaggara. It was not an easy task, considering that there really wasn't enough room for the 2 of them to stand side by side on any of the flat spots on the roof. Gaggara gave him a quick, questioning glance. Or maybe she was just checking that he was who she thought he was. Then she offered him a quick smile. "Are we ready to go?" "We fly east," Reyes told her. "Hold on a second." Reyes said about recasting the catsight spell on his girlfriend. Once he was done, Gaggara seemed to be looking about herself as if seeing the world for the first time again. "Meet you at the end of the village," Gaggara commented, and she took to the air, flying perhaps a little lower than she really needed to, over the crowd of villagers. Reyes watched her go for a second, and then he set about renewing the spell on himself. The result was amazing. He could see again, really see. The old version of the spell must have worn off sometime in the last hour without Reyes really noticing. Now he remembered just how good his eyesight could be when enhanced by such a simple spell. Before he left the rooftop himself, he sensed Creeley's eyes on him. The soldier was looking up at him. Then Creeley turned his attention back to the crowd, and he began to descend the steps, heading towards the east. "Let's get a move on then," he shouted. Reyes took to the air and followed the same flight plan as Gaggara had. He saw her perched on the roof of one of the buildings at the very end of the street, and landed next to her. "I hope this doesn't take too long," Gaggara told him. "I'd like to get some sleep tonight." "I know what you mean," Reyes agreed. "I wish we could have spent an extra day here, though," Gaggara commented. "All the same." "Oh?" Reyes asked. "There's a river here," Gaggara explained. "I'll bet it's untouched. There'll be a nice selection of pretty stones sitting on its banks. I'd love to spend the day replacing my lost collection." Reyes nodded. "Don't forget your promise to me," Gaggara reminded. "I want my stones back." "I won't," Reyes assured her. "Do you think there'll be any time for us to hunt? I'm feeling a little bit peckish," Gaggara commented. Then, before Reyes had a chance to reply, she took to the air and flew into the trees of the surrounding forest. Reyes decided to wait where he was. He could see that Gaggara hadn't gone far. She was circling the trees just beyond the village and was clearly waiting before she went any further. Slowly, Reyes turned his attention to the crowd. They looked little more than an undisciplined mob at the moment. The villagers were so occupied with taking everything they could that the only lit torches they carried were those placed on front of the handcarts and the barrow. "Going to burn down the village?" Reyes asked Creeley as the soldier reached the building he was perched on. "Probably not," Creeley replied. "It was all I could do to bring myself to mention it the first time. It's hard to tell people to burn down their own homes, even if they're never likely to return again." "Then the elves might get them," Reyes warned. "I'm aware of that," Creeley replied. "You can feel free to stay and burn them if you want." Reyes considered the idea for a moment, and then decided he wouldn't. After all, Orsa was still in the village somewhere, waiting to grab whatever loot the villagers had left behind. Reyes could imagine the big Minotaur sitting on the desk in the custodian's house where he'd last seen them, playing with his huge war axe. "Are you sure about Orsa? You seem to trust me and Gaggara all right." "The Minotaur refused to surrender his weapon," Creeley replied. "Had he done that, I might have felt I could trust him. I might even have returned his axe to him by now. If he isn't willing to obey me in one thing, how do I know he'd obey anyone else? How could I trust him? I'm sorry, the Minotaur stays." "I see," Reyes commented. "I suppose you do have a point." The street that passed through the centre of Fastbrook also continued on beyond the village. Here it was little more than a dirt track worn away by centuries of use by the locals pushing their carts to the market, or even just travelling to the capital of the dukedom. There were several places where the road got quite bumpy. Roads like this never seemed to be properly maintained. Everyone seemed to be on edge, as if terrified that the elves might suddenly spring out from behind the trees and attack them. For the most part, the villagers travelled in almost breathless silence, every villager listening to every single sound the forest made. It didn't help that every so often the forest would make some kind of noises that were natural considering the lateness of the hour, such as the hoot of an owl, the cry of a fox, or even the wind blowing lightly through the trees. But somehow, every little sound felt so sinister. For mile after mile, and hour after hour, the villagers of Fastbrook headed east along the dirt track. Reyes and Gaggara slowly fell into a pattern. Since Reyes spoke Flourish, he began to stick closer to the villagers, often taking up perches in the branches of the trees that lined the track. Gaggara, in the meantime, would scout the way ahead, often flying as far as a mile before she began to head back. It seemed strange to Reyes that with so many elves currently in the country, there seemed to be very little actual elvish activity. Gaggara would often return with reports as to the location of a nearby village, and invariably those villages would be in the hands of the elves. But as yet, there seemed to be no patrols watching the forests. The dirt track they followed took them primarily east, but it also leaned slightly to the north. When it eventually met the King's Eastern Highway, they were already a good deal further north than the village had been. Creeley continued the march, following the road to the north. "Isn't it dangerous to keep following the roads?" Reyes asked. "It is," Creeley agreed, "but I'm following landmarks. I don't know a more direct route. I wasn't expecting to have to do this when the country was under occupation." They continued on the King's Highway for close to another hour. Then, just as the remains of the city of Lamington hove into view on the horizon, Gaggara returned from her scouting mission and landed definitely on the same branch as Reyes. "What is it?" Reyes asked concerned. "Elves," Gaggara replied. "It looks like a huge army camped right outside the gates of the ruined city. If we follow this road much further, we'll be bumping into them." "Okay, sweetie," Reyes thanked her. He then quickly relayed the information to Creeley. "Time to leave the road then," Creeley replied. "We were going to have to soon anyway, but I would have preferred it if we could have stayed on the highway until we actually reached the city." "Which way?" Reyes asked. "East again," Creeley told Reyes. "But we won't have a dirt track to follow this time. We'll have to make our way through the trees themselves. Gaggara would be most useful to us if she stays ahead, so as to keep us heading straight." "I hope we don't have too far to go," Reyes commented. "Not too far," Creeley agreed. "But it will be dawn before we get there." The main problem with leaving the road, which was fairly nice and flat for carts to travel along, was that in this part of the forest there was no path of any kind. The way through was very bumpy, and since the carts were all as loaded as they could be, those pushing them often had to stop and retrieve items that had fallen off. It was also quite hard to find gaps between trees that were big enough for the handcarts to traverse. The roots of the trees would sometimes make the navigation of even the bigger gaps hazardous, as it required a little extra muscle power just to get over them, causing even more items to go flying. In one case, the cart in question lost the wheel. The cart, and most of the items that had been placed on it, had to be left behind. If things were bad for the handcarts, they were even worse for the horse-drawn cart. Most of the time it was too wide to fit through even the biggest gaps among the trees. More than once it made a sizable detour in order to negotiate part of the forest. Reyes wasn't alone in worrying that by doing so, the cart and all those that were on it were in danger. In the end, it too was dumped. The children were taken off of it and the horse was released from its harness. No one was about to suggest that they leave the horse. Besides, it could still carry some of the things that had been left on the cart. Everything else that had been on the cart had to be left behind. They had been on the move all night. Gaggara wasn't the only one feeling both tired and hungry. Reyes could feel himself constantly fighting off an attack of the yawns. He couldn't help thinking that he should fly over to his girlfriend. Maybe a little cool air blowing against his body would help to keep him awake. Then dawn began to make an appearance. The strange dawn half-light, the tiredness, and the hunger all seemed to gang up on Reyes at the same time, and for a moment he thought he caught sight of something out of the corner of his eye. He almost alerted Creeley to the event, but by the time he turned his head to look properly, it had gone. "You look concerned, my friend," Creeley called up to him. "Just me going mad, that's all," Reyes replied. "I thought I caught sight of a dryad." "A dryad?" There was a slight laugh in his voice as he said, "Well, I guess this is the hour for them. They're supposed to mean good luck, you know." "Indeed," Reyes replied, "or they augur death." Well, dryad or not, Reyes couldn't see it now. Perhaps it was nothing more than a strangely shaped tree that caught his imagination. No one seriously believed dryads actually existed. On the other hand, there were plenty of stories about them. Benevolent tree spirits all born from a particular breed of very rare tree with all sorts of natural magical powers. It depended on the story as to what sort of powers they had. He remembered his old nanny Clarina had often liked to tell him stories about dryads. He was brought back to the present by a sudden scream, or perhaps it was better described as a squawk. However it was described, it was in a voice that sounded very like Gaggara's. What was more, the cry was loud enough that every villager heard the sound and was suddenly on edge. "Gaggara!" Reyes cried out wildly. "Are you all right?" He took to the air, flying almost straight up, trying to catch any sign of her. "Help!" Gaggara screamed back, and this time the yell was punctuated by the distinctive sound of arrows being fired. Clearly she couldn't be that far away. "Gaggara!" Reyes shouted worriedly. Then he saw her. She was flying low over the treetops of the forest and performing a series of aerobatic manoeuvres that would put most harpies to shame. "I'm on my way." "Stay there," Gaggara replied urgently. "They missed me. I'm on my way back." Reyes waited there, hovering about the trees until he was sure Gaggara was safe. Then he descended and landed next to Creeley. "Gaggara is under attack. It might be an elven patrol. Tell the villagers to keep quiet." "Elves?" Creeley asked. "Why would the elves open fire on a harpy?" "Target practice," Reyes suggested. "Our two races aren't exactly the best of friends. If they thought they could shoot a harpy without anyone finding out about it, I don't doubt they'd do it." "Could be," Creeley accepted. "Then again, we are very close to our goal now. It could be a patrol sent out from our destination." And you didn't warn us, Race chastised. Sorry, Creeley replied. You aren't the only ones who are tired, you know. A moment later, Gaggara landed on a branch in one of the nearby trees. She quickly hopped down to the floor of the forest and ran up to Race, wrapping him in her arms. Oh, handsome, she said, shaking with fear. It's all right, my angel. You're safe now, Race replied. He held her close. I very nearly was your angel, Gaggara said, tucking her head into Race's shoulder. Hold me tightly. Race kissed her tenderly in the middle of her forehead. Then his teeth closed gently around her left ear, and he bit her lovingly. Don't do that, handsome, Gaggara pleaded. I'm already carrying your child. Sorry, Race replied, letting the ear go. I love you. I don't want to lose you. I'll take over the scouting duty for a while. But I don't speak flourish, Gaggara protested. The sound of approaching footsteps made them break from their clinch. The footsteps were hard and heavy. Those approaching were armoured. They still sounded like they were a fair way off. They're coming this way, Race told Creeley. He looked worriedly at the villagers. There's no way we can get everyone to hide before they get here. We'll just have to hope they are human. And if not, Creeley asked. Gaggara and I speak Elvish, Race suggested doubtfully. Leave the talking to us and maybe we'll be able to bluff our way out. You don't sound very certain, Creeley said. I'm not, Race confirmed. What can I possibly say to bluff an elven patrol that I have close to 100 humans standing behind me? It was too late to think any further about what to say. The patrol was getting closer by the second. Shortly, even Creeley seemed to be looking towards the sound, listening. Whoever they weren't doing a very good job of creeping up on their prey. Then Race heard a short exchange between two members of the patrol, most likely a soldier and an officer. They were locals. They were speaking flourish. We're here, sir. This is it? This is where the harpy led us? Yes, sir. Okay, good. We can't be all that far from her village. Once we pinpoint that, we can return home and come back in force to evict them. Flourish troops, Race reported to Creeley. And then he looked in the direction of the voices and shouted, Don't shoot! Don't attack! We surrender! There was another brief exchange of voices between the soldiers of the patrol. Then the officer's voice called out, Who is it that surrenders? My name is Race. Race the Moth, Race announced. I am here with a man called Creeley and the villagers of Fastbrook. The Moth, the voice called. Are you related to the Duke in any way? I am, Race replied. I am the adopted son of Duke Grunhade the Moth. I am the brother of Duke Greyforth the Moth. The voice was silent for a moment, and then it said, We saw a harpy flying this way. I thought she would lead the way to her village, but we found you instead. You should be careful. She might be lurking close by in the trees. Don't worry about it, Race replied, looking lovingly at Gaggara. I know exactly where she is. Then another voice, one of the other members of the patrol, spoke up. Sir, we've checked out who you've been talking to. There are about 100 peasants, villagers by the look of it, and they are being led by a soldier. However, the voice asked, This Race the Moth you've been talking to is a harpy. He's standing beside another harpy, presumably the female we followed back there. I see, the voice said. Prepare our archers. Sir, another soldier piped in. I remember hearing all sorts of rumours at the time of Jenny the Moth got engaged to Prince Goti. Race the Moth is a harpy. He's the one that escaped from the tower the day before his execution. So we should carry out his execution, the officer suggested. Perhaps, sir, but it would be better if we questioned him as to why he's here first. It might also help to improve morale for people to bear witness to a public execution. Besides, the officer questioned, if he truly is the adopted brother of Duke Greyforth, the Duke might not be too happy if we kill him out of hand. You have a point, the officer commented. Very well, Race, we accept your surrender. You and your friend get to live, at least until your brother sees you and decides your fate.